Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary King, last month you received a letter from over 50 civil rights and disability rights organizations representing children of color, low-income children, English learners, students with disabilities, LGBT young people, and other vulnerable student populations regarding your responsibilities in enforcing the new education law. Now, here are the organizations that represent exactly the kids who this law is intended to help. And they wrote, and I quote, "Given the long history of state and local decisions shortchanging vulnerable students, the department cannot shirk from its responsibility and regulatory and enforcement responsibilities to ensure that the implementation of ESSA eliminates, not perpetuates, persistent inequities in our nation's public education system." So if I can, just briefly, Mr. Secretary, what is the Department of Education's role in ensuring the accountability safeguards in the new education law are actually enforced? That is, once a district announces it has satisfied the law, are you required just to back out of the room and do nothing more?
No, I mean, we take very seriously that our responsibility is to set good, clear guardrails in the regulations, and then to review and approve state plans, and to ensure that those plans are implemented in a way that advances equity and excellence.
Excellent. So thank you. You know, the Republicans have talked about the congressional intent in passing this new law, and I think that question is not difficult to answer. The first version of this legislation back in 1965 was to affirm the federal role in protecting civil rights and educational opportunities for all students, especially our most vulnerable students. That's been the basis of federal aid to education from the very beginning, and it's carried directly forward into this statute. Now, I voted for this law on the explicit agreement that the Department of Education would enforce its accountability provisions through meaningful regulations. That's clear in the language of the law, and I think it's also good policy. When the federal government gives the states billions of taxpayer dollars to improve education for our most vulnerable kids, then it's critical that the Department of Education ensure that those states actually use the money to accomplish those ends. This is one of the conditions on which a lot of senators voted for this law, the condition on which many House Democrats voted for this law, and the condition on which the President of the United States signed this bill into law. There is a very public record about this. The ink is barely dry on that record, and I trust you'll keep it in mind as you go forward. Now, the new elementary and secondary education law directs billions of federal taxpayer dollars to states to, quote, "provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education." To make sure that happens, Congress wrote into the law critical requirements. This requirement says that ESSA funds must be used to supplement, not supplant, current state and local funds. In other words, federal dollars must provide additional resources to low-income schools and not simply replace existing investments. We've been talking about that as we've gone along. Secretary King, can you talk for just a minute about how the department is enforcing this critical accountability provision to ensure that federal education dollars are truly providing additional resources in high-poverty schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges, as I've described, the implementation of supplement not supplant under No Child Left Behind was not effective in achieving this goal of ensuring that the federal dollars are truly supplemental. If we look at individual districts, you can see a 25%, 30%, 40% in some cases, additional spending in non-Title I schools than in Title I schools. And in fact, the federal dollars were being used essentially to backfill. Going forward, the new law gives us the opportunity to create a regulation that requires districts to develop their own methodology that will ensure that at least as much is spent in state and local funds in Title I schools as is spent in the average non-Title I school. That's what we've proposed to the Negotiated Rulemaking Committee, and they are working through that process.
And so let me just be clear on this. Is it possible for the Department of Education to require states and districts to work towards specific outcomes, that is to have guardrails, without mandating specific accounting methods to achieve those ends?
Exactly right.
All right, good. You know, when the federal government gives states billions of taxpayer dollars to improve education for our most vulnerable kids, then I think it's critical that the Department of Education ensure that those states actually use the money to help those kids. This was one of the conditions on which a lot of senators voted for this law, and it is something that we are going to stick with. The Democrats have spent years fighting to make sure that this reauthorization is about additional dollars to make sure that they support all of our teachers and all of our kids to get a decent education. We just want you to keep that in mind as you go forward. Thank you.